SpaceMobile podcast.
We just basically come from be seamless, regardless of where you are. We don't want the user even to know that it's connected by satellite. Listen, the opportunity that we have is very, very, very large.
Hey everyone, not sure if this is going to work. Let me just see. People give me a thumbs up if you can hear me okay. I tried to use the hotel Wi-Fi, but that didn't work too well. And then I think I'm roaming on Bell's network, but then I think I used up all my 5G connectivity. And so I think I'm probably running this space on 3G. So I'm not sure if that's going to work, but I'm getting thumbs up. So seems like it's okay. But I'm in the Vancouver airport. I'm in the hallway of our hotel. Unfortunately, our room does not have a private place to do this space, and this hotel in particular does not have a business center either. So, so I'm just doing this out here in the hallway. But yeah, I just wanted to get people together. Sorry, I've been away. I was actually been with family here in Vancouver for spring break. We went skiing this week, and of course, before we started the trip, everyone was sick, and so not ideal. But happy to say that everyone's had a great time thus far, and we're coming to the tail end of this trip. And of course, during this entire week, while I was kind of out of commission, of course, a lot of news kind of hit the wire, and whether that was macro stuff or things related to AST, and of course, some things in the space sector as well. But I did want to fire up a space and just provide some preliminary thoughts about the rumored Amazon interest in Globalstar, and then talk about production as well. So let's talk about Amazon. So the Financial Times ran a report that Amazon is supposedly interested in acquiring Globalstar. They've had talks, and for those that remember, Jay Monroe, who is the CEO of Globalstar, who owns a pretty hefty portion of it. There were rumors, I think it was like last spring, that he was interested in selling the company, and clearly the leaks for the sale process came from Monroe and his advisors, and he was seeking something north of $10 billion in terms of valuation for the company. And I think it's important to note that we're pretty much there. And so for any event-driven or merger arb or speculators who are trying to see if there's any potential upside from Globalstar, we're pretty much at his asking price. Now, it is possible that perhaps the company could sell for a higher price than what is being kicked around. However, I would say that it sounds like there was some follow-up reporting, I think, from Semaphore, saying that M&Os had taken a look at Globalstar and had passed, and it seems like SpaceX had probably passed as well. I think for SpaceX, for those that are wondering, it probably doesn't make sense for SpaceX to do this deal right now, just given that they've got their IPO coming up, and on top of that, they're trying to close the EchoStar spectrum deal. And so from a regulatory standpoint, you probably don't want to go into the FCC process and muddy the waters by going through the approval process, which for EchoStar, I think they're targeting sometime the end of summer of 2027. And so by doing that deal, and then potentially getting Globalstar, that transaction going through regulatory process, that just would complicate things quite a bit. And so, so I think it's probably off the table for SpaceX, but who knows, right? Because I think from SpaceX's perspective, if you look at things from an antitrust point of view, for them to buy EchoStar spectrum and then to purchase Globalstar, and then there's like supposedly rumors that maybe they're interested in Iridium. I think that's probably too many deals for them to try to get through regulatory review, but who knows? But I think from what I've heard, it sounds like SpaceX, that interest around Globalstar wasn't really there, and it seems like Monroe has done. He's used the press to kind of try to drum up interest, and it does seem like the Amazon interest is real. However, who knows, right? Like for those that don't know, I think Amazon had tested Globalstar's terrestrial spectrum, this private N53 band back in, I think it was like 2013, 2014, and they never pulled the trigger on it. And so, there is some familiarity there, but we'll see. And I think, one of the key takeaways is that, for those people who the naysayers, you've got all these like consultants who are at SAT show who a year, 2 years ago were like, oh, direct to device, it's not really a real market, it's niche, and who knows, like, if there's any real serious business that can come about it. And then, of course, this time around SAT show, like that's all people talk about is direct to device. And those same consultants who poo-pooed the market are now spreading rumors like, that, that SpaceX and Amazon and everybody and their brothers like trying to get into the market. And so it's kind of paradoxical, right? Kind of funny. Um but yeah, I think, for Amazon, so taking a step back, like Globalstar, what do these guys have? So they do have rights to 7.7 megahertz of L band, and that's for uplink. And then they've got 16.5 megahertz of S band for downlink. And out of that S band, actually, about 11.5 megahertz in the US, which is, the most valuable market. 11.5 is actually carved out for terrestrial use. And so not for MSS, but terrestrial private, spectrum use. And so, it's now part of the 3GPP standard. And Globalstar for the longest time has been trying to sell, enterprises and companies on using this 11.5 megahertz of spectrum, which is similar to like, Wi-Fi, right? Like, you could license that to a company to use in certain geographies, and that would be TDD or TDD, which is, it's not full duplex, but you would actually do both the up and down link on that one channel. And so that's something that Monroe has been trying to, pitch to companies, to MNOs and others as, hey, we've got this like unencumbered, Wi-Fi like spectrum that you could use. And so I think Amazon could actually be quite interested in that part of the spectrum, for terrestrial use, and that could be part of the reason why they're pursuing this, right? And so, um, but I think, you know, looking at Globalstar overall, just to, level set what exactly is there. You've got that, again, the L-band spectrum, 7.7 megahertz for uplink, 16.5 megahertz of S-band spectrum for downlink. However, 11.5 of that is carved out for terrestrial use in the US. And then, with that, of course, you have Apple, which owns effectively 20% economic ownership in Globalstar, but then they have the rights to 85% of current and all future network capacity. And so Apple effectively has what we call in deal parlance a poison pill, right? They have a veto on any deal. So they have a right of first refusal. So let's say if Amazon, offered a price like Jay Monroe's like, hey, that's great, I want to sell the company. Apple would have the ability to top that offer if they wanted to buy the company. But the key question there is to ask yourself is like, does Apple actually want to own this company? And based off of the structuring that they put in place with Globalstar, it's very clear they don't want to own it. They don't want to become a service provider. They don't want to compete against their MNO customers. They don't want to be an FCC regulated entity. And so they don't want it, right? And but what they did want out of this was to provide satellite connectivity, like a new feature for their iPhones and watches, which enabled SOS messaging, some level of tracking. And they thought, back in 20, when they negotiated this, I think in 2021, and then announced it in 2022, and they threw like under $2 billion at this. They're like, hey, we're going to provide this new feature for the phone, and it's going to help us sell more handsets. What they didn't foresee, for whatever reason, is that AST SpaceMobile was going to provide broadband connectivity, and then Starlink was going to get into the market as well. And so, for them, this is a very suboptimal situation, right? Because what was interesting back in 2022 is now kind of a not a has been solution, but it's something that's not very interesting, right? Like for anyone who's used Apple's SOS messaging, you have to like be outside, point the phone directly at the satellite. You have to hold it there. You can send messages, which is pretty handy. Like if they're in when there's like no other connectivity where you are, like if you're out in the woods, it's great to have. But from a practical perspective, you can't do a voice call, you can't do video or anything rich. It just is very short messages, and you have to point the phone at the satellite in order to send and receive messages, and that can take a few minutes to perhaps even longer, and it's not very reliable, right? But if you believe what the information reported over the last several months, Apple in the next iterations of the iPhone, they want to get to a service, support satellite service that will be seamless, that will work in your pocket, that will work indoors, and that's something that Globalstar cannot provide today, and it's not something that Globalstar can provide for probably the medium term, or the future for that matter, right? And um, so that leaves Apple in a pretty tough spot, right? Like they've invested in this company. They've also they've paid off debt for Globalstar. They've also fronted capital for, um, upcoming constellation to not only, refresh the existing constellation, which I believe, let's see my notes. I think Apple is paying for about 95% of the cost of replenishing the existing constellation of Globalstar satellites. So MDA Space is building 17 satellites, which will just help replace the current constellation. And then they have this plan, which they announced in February 2025, where MDA Space is going to produce 50 Aurora satellites for their next generation, what they're calling C3 constellation for Globalstar. And so that one is going to be more capable. There's not like a ton of details out about it, but it will be, these will be software-defined satellites. For those that have followed some of my previous investments, this will leverage SatixFy, the company that MDA Space acquired. It will leverage that technology, the ASICs there. And so these satellites will have higher power. It will have beamforming capabilities. It will utilize the same exact orbits, but supposedly offer better performance in terms of reaching a device that is compatible indoors to a degree, and also in cars. There'll be less of a need to orient the antenna towards the satellite. So what they're hoping to achieve is better messaging, narrowband data, the ability to allocate capacity more dynamically. And so if there's more users in a specific area, they can put more capacity there versus having fixed capacity in all the areas of coverage. But there's no indication that that constellation will have any ability to do broadband, right? And so going back to what I was saying before about Apple, like they're in a tough spot, right? Like they've got their chips in with Globalstar. It's a nice kind of backup service. But in terms of the roadmap, like it's going to get better, but it's not going to be broadband. And so for Apple, like what's the point of supporting this thing when you don't have control over it, right? Because they don't want control over it. But then your partner is kind of weak because it's Globalstar and they need money, and the technology is old, and they don't have any innovation, right? Like they went out on an RFP process, and they went to MDA Space and said, "Hey, can you show me what you got? Like, I want to do these things, and can you do them?" And MDA Space is like, "Hey, here's the Aurora satellite. This is the best we can do." And they're like, "Okay, great, we'll do that." But it's not good enough, right? Because then they're competing against AST SpaceMobile and Starlink. And so for Apple, um, based off of some of the reporting this past week, they kind of want to get rid of being in this spot where they're tied to this kind of mediocre service that's not going to get any better. And while you've got Starlink and AST that are going to surpass anything that they're doing, near term, medium term, long term. And so with that, there is this idea that perhaps Apple will exit Globalstar, because they are acknowledging that train has left the station, and why compete, right? Because at the end of the day, like it's almost the analogy would be similar to where Apple has kind of made the right move, at least so far, in AI, where it's like, hey, we're not going to invest in AI, we're going to let OpenAI, Google, Anthropic like duke it out, and then we'll be the gatekeeper. We'll allow people to access AI, pick their API on the phone. And so all of a sudden the market's like, hey, that's great. You're not spending money to go do it, and you're getting the benefit of on your phone. Whether that or not that's a good long-term strategy, who knows? But at least Apple, at least from the AI perspective, like maybe they're taking a similar tack for direct to device. And so that's where Amazon comes in, because then I think, for Amazon, they're clearly focused on fixed wireless. They're doing launch. They don't have a strategy in direct to device or IoT. And so this could kind of fill that niche for them, right? And so if you want to have the ability to offer, a full stack, as I know it's like an overused term, but a full stack offering versus Starlink, then direct to device is pretty important. Now, does that mean that they're going to go um, offer the service themselves and compete with Starlink? That's somewhat questionable. It's unclear, right? Because I think obviously Amazon has the consumer relationship, and they could offer a service in tandem with their Leo service. However, if it were a mobile device, that would be pretty tough, right? Because you need terrestrial spectrum, which is low band, 600 to 900 megahertz, to offer something that's comparable to what MNOs provide. I'm guessing Amazon doesn't want to get into that level of service. Maybe they could become like a virtual network operator and partner with the Verizon or AT&T, and then they could layer on this new direct to device service on top of it. But I think going down that route is probably not going to be that economically attractive. Although Amazon could justify it because they obviously they could generate economics in other ways from consumers. But I think for Amazon at this point, it's probably worth the optionality, right? Because I think owning spectrum is always a good thing. Um, and for Amazon, they could in the future, like once Starlink has built out their fixed wireless business, they could use that satellite capacity to then start building a direct to device constellation. And it may not be focused on mobile phones, but it'll be 3GPP compatible. They could do IoT. They could do a bunch of different things. They could try to sell, services to military. There's a whole host of things that you could try to do, right? Like the key thing is having the ability to build a capable constellation, and then having spectrum, access to spectrum, which AST has access to spectrum in two ways. One is through its terrestrial, you know, they get access to prime real estate terrestrial spectrum through MNO partners. And then they, of course, have their Element S-band strategy where they bought 80-year usage rights of Legato in the US and Canada. And then they have ITU priority rights globally, which they're going to, for example, in Europe, they're going to go through a regulatory process and get 2 gigahertz of spectrum in 2027 through the EU process. But but for Amazon, like there is optionality, and it's somewhat cheap, right? Like it's $10 billion plus for Globalstar. You get an existing constellation. It's not great, but it is a constellation. But the key thing is like you have these global rights for spectrum, and so Amazon could do a lot of things with that. Now, some people may ask, well, is this competitive? Is it a threat to AST? It could be long term. But as we've said before, like the market is going to be huge. It's massive, right? Like it's not just mobile phones, it's IoT devices. I mean, we've seen now like the company is getting Golden Dome awards. I mean, the company's with its particular satellite, technology, um, there's other applications beyond just a broadband connectivity for mobile phones or IoT devices. There's 10 different military use cases for it, right? Like sensing, jamming, GPS, all kinds of things, right? And so Amazon could be thinking about some of these things too. And so, however, because it's Amazon in talks with Globalstar, it's probably going to be something that's more consumer focused. It's not going to be, if it had more, I guess, military applications, then it would probably be an acquisition done via Blue Origin. So, there is a lot of optionality there, and I can see why Amazon wants to do this because I mean, one of the biggest things, the reasons why Amazon might want to do this deal is that, again, they want to preserve some optionality, but there's also a defensive reason too, right? Like if they truly thought that Starlink was going to buy Globalstar and this was kind of um, their one shot to make a defensive play, then that might be reason enough to do the deal, right? Like Globalstar, it's not like it's hemorrhaging a ton of money, and so for Amazon by acquiring it, they can continue to provide service to Apple, and then at some point, decide to make some changes in the future. Now, as I mentioned before, there is a poison pill here because Apple will have the final say, and they can make life hard for anybody who buys this. But maybe there's a world where Amazon gets concessions from Apple in terms of giving up the 85% of capacity rights. Maybe Amazon, and Apple has been extract serious, flesh for this, but in return, Amazon would effectively, provide Apple with a much better direct to device, service and, some type of, financial and capacity commitments. But who knows? I think it's very telling that the rumors were spring last year, and now it's 1 year later, and now you've got leaks of a potential deal, obviously coming from the Global Star side, because there's no reason why Amazon would leak this. And that, hey, they're close to a deal, and they're working on these complexities. Sometimes you see these leaks, by the way, where the sell side, the bankers or lawyers are trying to drum up the interest. They're like, hey, Amazon's really close. Like, are you sure SpaceX or Google or someone, like, are you sure you don't want to, have another look or stop this before it goes away? And so yeah, I think now, you know, I couldn't tell you what the probability of a deal is because this deal, if it does happen, is going to be very complex, and I'd be very curious to see what the deal terms are. But um, as I've said before, it's because it's Amazon. There's a whole host of reasons why they might want to buy this deal, or do this deal. It could be for satellite connectivity, or it could just be purely for the terrestrial spectrum, right? That 11.5 megahertz of spectrum in the US is quite valuable, and it's already authorized for terrestrial use. And so if you can imagine it being used, I remember Jay Monroe telling people like, hey, well, we've got this premium Wi-Fi service that people, anyone could license this from us and pay us royalty. And then if you could imagine Amazon, providing terrestrial service across the US for its customers, like there's some value in that, right? But I think the other thing to keep in mind is that 11.5 megahertz of spectrum is low power. They don't have regulatory approval to run high power, and so it would be primarily, I believe, solely for local networks. And so it's not as if they could run a nationwide network with towers, lighting up that 2.4 gigahertz of 11.5 megahertz of S-band spectrum. So anyway, but yeah, those are some initial thoughts. I mean, I think the key takeaway here, though, is that the other thing I forgot to mention is, Amazon could also buy this could buy Globalstar, and then go to Bell and say, hey, you've got the satellites, I got the spectrum. Can you light up my spectrum? And, I provide this special Amazon service. And Bell would be like, yeah, sure, I'll do that. And so that would be another, option for Bezos and Amazon. They could leverage AST SpaceMobile's, Block 3 satellites, which are focused on mid-band, because this fits perfectly in the L and S band that it'll be serving, and allow Amazon to provide that service. Another thing to keep in mind is that if Amazon buys Globalstar, I guess there's this possibility that they could try to get Verizon or AT&T or T-Mobile to utilize their service. But I would just point out that MNOs are wary of Amazon, just like they're wary of SpaceX. And so any type of relationship where Amazon clearly owns the customer through its Prime service. And so I think AT&T, Verizon, and T-Mobile would be wary of giving their customer control over to Amazon. And as we all know, this is another thing to point out. I think Amazon is contemplating, coming out with AI devices and potentially a mobile phone again those, some folks will remember that Amazon tried to create the Fire Phone or whatever it was. But that's another wrinkle I think that's probably gonna be tough for Apple to sort out. Like if they ultimately do acquiesce to Amazon buying Globalstar, they also probably in the back of their minds know that Amazon's probably going to roll out a new phone. And so what kind of implications does that have in terms of, enabling a future competitor? So there's a lot of stuff going on here. It's very complex. I'm just pointing out like some of the issues to think about. But yeah, it's not very straightforward. The other thing I would say is I did see MDA Space rallying on Friday. If Amazon buys Globalstar, on the one hand, from a credit perspective, like that could be good. Like Amazon may go to MDA Space and say, "Hey, we want a bigger constellation. We want better specs. Can you go build it?" But if you think about it, like they already had that with Apple, right? Like Apple is about as good of a credit as it gets, and Apple is already fronting all this investment for this new constellation. So I don't think Amazon changes that. And actually, what I think the market got wrong is that this is like a huge risk for MDA Space, right? Because like for Amazon, they're already building, you know, hundreds of and ultimately what will be thousands of LEO satellites. So they've already got like satellite prowess, satellite making prowess. And so if anything, if Amazon does buy Globalstar, they'll probably bring satellite design and production in-house. And so I think the future, once the 17 satellites are done to replenish the Globalstar constellation, that future 50 plus satellite order for Aurora, I think that's going to be a huge risk. And so I think MDA Space potentially could lose a pretty big customer here. So anyway, there's some additional thoughts. I've got to think through this one a bit more, but I think key takeaway though is that this market, direct to device, the, you know, the the whole thought that this is a niche market and that it's not going to be very big. You're seeing, SpaceX spend over $20 billion on spectrum. Amazon's in talks to buy Globalstar for plus 10 billion, possibly. Maybe Iridium. I don't know if Iridium is going to get acquired, but clearly they own some valuable spectrum. But can Matt Desch actually get um, someone to lease his spectrum, which is what he talked about on the last earnings call? It's possible. So clearly, like this is a big area of strategic focus, and so it's as I said before, it's kind of funny that you've got all these legacy guys in the satellite industry poo-poo direct to device for gosh, maybe it's been almost a decade now, and now this is all they can talk about, right? Like you've got Viasat, SES, everybody and their brother is talking about, hey, we've got a direct to device strategy, and this is the best thing since sliced bread. So it's just kind of funny seeing that, and even these supposed consultants who poo-pooed it for many years, now it's like the only thing they can talk about, right? Like I think Tim Farrar was the one who was like spreading the SpaceX rumor, like, oh, the deal's imminent, and of course it didn't happen. And and then someone shared with me that he's doing a call with Deutsche Bank to talk to people about the landscape, because clearly, like a lot of um, event-driven investors and hedge fund guys are following the industry, and whether people have investments in EchoStar or Iridium or Globalstar. I mean, clearly people have made a lot of money. AST SpaceMobile too. Everybody wants to learn more about this industry, and unfortunately, they're learning from Tim Farr, but that's okay because that's how we make money, and those guys don't make money. But anyway, so moving on. Let's see. I didn't want to give a bit more color on production for AST SpaceMobile. And so obviously, like everyone's focused on batch production, and and there's been some anxiety on Twitter. It's like, what's the company doing? And I think it's I finally got a chance to catch up on for most of Cook's space, and I think he said it rightly, which is what I've been saying too, is that this stuff is not easy, right? Like if a Bell, it's not as if a Bell or management are trying to slow roll things, right? Like they want to get things done quickly, but you have to, especially for the company's DNA, like you want to get things done the right way the first time, all the time, right? And so if this stuff was easy, then other people would be doing it, right? But there's only one company that created this market and innovated, and of course you got Starlink, following, and in terms of competition, just to reiterate, like what Starlink is doing with their first generation satellites is pretty much like narrowband messaging. The second generation satellites, they're going to try to catch up to what the Block 2 satellites are capable of now, but by then, which is 2027, 2028, we will have moved on to additional iterations. And so, and even then, I'm not even sure like those will be broadband for Starlink. But anyway, I did want to provide some color. So, when the company did talk about stacking being a problem, and so for those that have followed us closely or haven't followed closely, AST has these tuna cans or rings, as we'll call them, and in order for the next generation to um, in order to send enough in a rocket launch, you have to save as much weight as possible. And so the company has gone the extra effort. So like for example, I think Elon this past week or so had tweeted about how steel was a great solution for them for Starship, and he talked about how using aluminum has it's not as strong, and there's like structural issues there, but then composites are just too difficult, right? Like it's very expensive to deal with. Well, AST has decided to go down the composite route where you if you invest the time and energy into developing satellites with composites, it is tough as hell and it's hard to get off the ground. But once you do it, the weight savings versus and the strength that you get out of that are unparalleled, right? And so the company, I think they got their first batch of composites, and when they tested them, I think they found that they were not structurally strong enough. And this is what can happen with composites, where um, you know when you go through modeling and you come up with designs, they may not stand up to actual physical tests, right? And so whether you've got a for the company, they had to go back to their drawing board in some respects, and they had to solve this issue, which is stacking, right? So if you can imagine, like if you have three of these satellites or four of these satellites stacked, the vertical pressure that especially the bottom satellite has is tremendous, right? Because it's got to support three satellites above it, and then for that second satellite, it's got to support two satellites above it. And so it's not just vertical, but it's also horizontal. Because, for example, in a Blue Origin um, rocket, you've got these things have to be, they get when it's on the launcher, the rocket is sideways, and then it gets lifted up vertically. But anyway, from what I understand, I think the company solved this issue back in February, or sometime over the course of February. And so, if you can imagine that tuna can, like if it's vertically not strong enough, what you can do for the rings is you can put maybe tubes around it, right? Like whether it's composite or potential metals, like you can reinforce it, and you do that to the point where you don't want to add too much weight, but you want to add enough where at least the bottom ring is strong enough to support the top three, and then then the second one is strong enough to support the top two or one, and then and so on, right? And so I believe the company solved this in February, and then obviously then you've got to integrate the payloads, and here um, there when we talk about payloads, that includes the microns and then everything that goes inside as well. And so I believe the company had talked about having enough microns built. I think perhaps maybe the company is now around they've made enough microns for 30 satellites. And so they've built a lot of these things, right, in terms of microns. And I believe payloads, I'm not sure exactly how many payloads they have, but now that they've solved stacking, meaning so the whatever rings that they have on site, they've reinforced them properly, and so they can use those. And then you've got to integrate. the microns and the payloads into the tuna can, and then you've got to go through testing, right? And testing takes some time. But it sounds like the company's probably, or not probably, they are on target to get the first batch done by the end of April, and then that first batch will get shipped to Florida, and it'll go up on Falcon 9. And then shortly thereafter, there'll be another batch, right? And so we're kind of at this point where we've reached terminal velocity for production hell, where they've solved stacking in February. They're now integrating payloads. They now have got to test them. And so I think we're going to start seeing a much faster cadence where the company is confident that they are still on target for 45 satellites for 2026. Now that's going to be, I mean, it's going to be pretty much gangbusters, which is actually going to be quite fun to watch because they're going to start pumping out these batches and sending them down to the Cape where, the first two are going to be Falcon 9 launches. We might see, for those that have been following closely, we've seen, obviously we're waiting for New Glenn 3, which I think that's now targeted for sometime April 12th to potentially April 14th. But beyond that, putting that one aside, like Blue Origin has now got an STA for New Glenn 4, 5, and I think 6, or yeah, maybe they got 6 already. And so, how many of those are going to be for AST SpaceMobile? It's unclear, but if it's even just 2 of them, and you stack 6 to 8 of these satellites, that's going to go a pretty far away in terms of being able to hit your, 45 cadence for this year. So, but yeah, I think we're kind of at this point where the company is very confident. They've solved stacking. One thing I forgot to mention is that as part of that solution, the ring has been designed, and so instead of retrofitting, these tubes to strengthen the ring, the future, rings, which call it, say, Bluebird 13 plus, those are actually going to have composites at the source that are designed to be, that have these improvements where they're going to be strong enough. And so, yeah, I think now we're in this like target zone where once April kicks off, like it's going to be nonstop. And so my guess is, this average of 1.5 launches, or one to two, what was it? One launch every 1 to 2 months. We actually could start seeing probably more like, if they're going to get to the 45 that they need, it could be more like 2 launches a month, or who knows. But anyway, I just wanted to pass that along because I think that's an important point where who talks about uh the production constipation. I think we're now kind of at the point where we're going to have production diarrhea, or whatever you want to call it, where these things are going to be flying out like hotcakes. And so the fact that, for example, we've got 30 satellites worth of microns already built. We just now need to get those composite rings into the door, get everything, the microns, the rest of the payloads integrated and tested, and then shipped. So yeah, I mean, I think the company is very confident. Now we've kind of gotten over this hump. Now, in terms of the Blue Origin New Glenn 3 launch, yes, it's been delayed, and that's pretty much out of the company's hands. I mean, as everyone knows, like, we sent the satellite down to the Cape quite some time ago. But as I've mentioned before, that New Glenn 3 launch is absolutely critical to show that they can do a refurbish and relaunch. And so they want to make sure that they get that right. And whatever hiccups or things, double checking that they want to do, like, that's just causing this thing to kind of get pushed back, which it is what it is, and I'm okay with it. So anyway, the last thing I'll mention, and then I've got to hop, but Space Force, this was, and I retweeted Space Case Taylor's tweet about this, but some numbers came out today, which were quite staggering. I think for this coming year, the Space Force budget for funding is the request is $71.2 billion, which is 77% higher than 40 billion, which was budgeted in 26. And so, yeah, this just like underscores how important space is for the US in terms of strategic priorities where I think companies like AST SpaceMobile, Rocket Lab, Planet Lab, any you name it, Black Sky, any of these other companies, like it's going to be a key focus, right? Like spending is only going to go up, and um, whether especially for companies that have dual use case, which AST does, which is it's got the commercial side, but also the government, defense side. Um, it's going to be a very interesting, next 2-3 years, right? And you obviously got the SpaceX IPO coming up, which I didn't even talk about. Like the bankers, I believe, discussing a $2 trillion valuation range, which is pretty crazy. But yeah, things are coming together, and I think for AST, obviously production can't come and production and launch, the affirmation of 6 satellites per month, which I think is going to come sometime by the end of Q2. Obviously they could be at 4 satellites a month, 5 satellites a month, but eventually you get to 6. With the delays that we've had, I believe they're probably hoping to reiterate that, or to confirm that by the end of the second quarter. But yeah, I think all the pieces are lining up, right? And so, maybe this Global Star deal will happen, and it'll bring even more strategic focus to the sector. And I mentioned this before. AST's testing with Apple, it's testing with Meta. It already has a partnership with Google, and so yeah, if Amazon does pull the trigger on Global Star, like, does that cause other strategic movement, right? Because then AST SpaceMobile becomes, from a strategic perspective, much more interesting for everyone else, right? Or maybe Amazon is like, hey, AST, can we use your satellites to light up the spectrum that we just bought? And so, anyway, I'll close it there. I am. I will be back home next week, and so we'll be more active. But yeah, I'm interested to see what happens in the coming week, and obviously there's a lot of stuff going on in Iran, and for near term volatility, that's not good. But I think, as Michael Pollack said it in a presentation at SAT Show, like the conflicts in Iran and Venezuela just highlight the importance of what AC is doing. And he didn't specifically allude to exactly what that meant, but I think we all kind of know. Um, and so I think the importance of what the company's doing, is increasing by the day, right? And so if you're an investor in ASD, we're in a very good spot. So I'll end it there. Thanks everyone for joining. And yeah, as this stuff kind of evolves and unfolds for Amazon, and maybe something related to Iridium and what have you, yeah, it'll be interesting to see, what the implications are for AST. And my personal view is, I think the company's strategic value just keeps going up. So thanks everyone for joining, and we'll talk again soon. Take care.
Thanks for listening to the AST SpaceMobile podcast. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please share it with others, post about it on social media, or leave a rating and review. To catch all the latest news about AST SpaceMobile, make sure to subscribe. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.
We're doing something very, very big. And I think with this technology, we can really affect billion lives.
AST SpaceMobile is the only company that has proven technology to deliver cellular broadband connectivity directly from space to the everyday smartphone.
People will just basically turn their phone and be seamless, regardless of where you are. We don't want the user even to know that it's connected by satellite. Our role is to bring this into reality, always in partnership with the MNOs.
Listen. Waffles.